Hi. So today I'm going to tell you a story, and you might notice I'm wearing a hat. The hat gives you a clue as to where the story comes from. That's if you know what it means. The colours are, I can't see. I'll look at the screen. Red. Oh, yeah. And green. Oh, yeah. And white. And the colours of Wales. Now, Wales is a country. It's a country where my dad was born and comes from. And this story was told by a very old man who also came from Wales. And this very old man came from a little village called Pontyfendigaig. Yes, Pontyfendigaig, which happens to be a village where I've been and my friends live. Now, the very old man was 95 when he told this story, and his name was John Jones. Uh, and this story was written down. But I'll tell you something about Pontyfendigaid before we start. It's a village which is deep in the countryside. It's an undulating countryside. It's up and down, and there are big trees everywhere as you drive along the little roads. The roads, you think you're not going very far, but 40 minutes later, you're still trying to find this place. And it's got, like I said, it's got trees, it's got woods, it's got rivers, it's got even places um, that you can go and swim in the rivers. It's got little pubs and lots of lovely people there. And reputedly, well, right now the people are quite mixed. My friend comes from England, but in the past, perhaps more people had been born there, their fathers had been born there, their mothers had been born there, maybe their grandfathers lived in the same village, maybe in their village they had cousins and aunties and uncles, but we don't know. In this story, we'll find out about the boy in this story. But there's another thing you should know before we start. That stories in Wales and in many other countries include a reference to what they call fairy folk. Now, you might have come across fairies as being, well, I don't know. Are they little girly girl fairies with little wings that flap around? Yeah, probably. Well, these are not like that. These are, if you take it literally, that means if you think of them as something that's real, you might consider them to be little men and women. They don't have wings, but they do live uh, reputedly. They You can come across them in nature, and I think there's a kind of association with being underground, or maybe we don't really know exactly where. Maybe they're actually in here, and they're about what happens to us when we allow ourselves to be alone with our thoughts, but in a relaxed way in nature. Certainly, that's what seems to happen in this story, but I don't want to get ahead of that. So it's about 100 or 200 years ago. There aren't cars, just so that you remember. Uh, there's no internet, just so that you remember. There's no, what else isn't there? There's no internet, no cars, no TV. No TV. I don't think there's even radio. I'll have to check that up. No TV, no internet, no radio, no podcasts, no smartphones, no cars, no skateboards, no roads as such. They probably had places that you could pass with horse and cart. But people were busy getting on with stuff. They didn't tend to travel loads, not all the time. Um, not out of their area. So it's probably a time that was very much like now. People were mostly in their homes, a bit like now. I mean, they were probably associating with their people they knew in their village. But you have to remember, people are still people, and even without the internet, they wanted things the same as we do now, such as, well, they wanted their children to do well. They wanted status. Status. Status is when people look up to you. They wanted well, those are the sort of things you need to fill in. But let's say they this was a family and this was a boy whose parents were very ambitious for him. He was an only child. He had no brothers and sisters. And so I suppose they put all their hopes and dreams into seeing their son do well in life. And in their eyes, that was what they wanted for him, was that he become a clergyman. Now, a clergyman is somebody who's real respected, who once they got a job at those times, that job would be for the rest of their life. They were doing something that was helping other people, guiding people. In Wales, if you were a clergyman, you didn't have to give up anything specific, like in some countries where you'd have to give up getting married and having children. No, he could still be a clergyman, and he could still get married, and he could still have children. And in fact, I think in those times when you became a clergyman and got your first job, you would get a house. So the parents were very focused that this boy might become a clergyman. And the boy himself was quite happy with that idea. He thought, that's great. I'd like to be a clergyman. He could see what the benefits were. He could see that if he was a clergyman, his parents would be happy. That'd be one thing. He could see that if he was a clergyman, people would listen to him, and he would have status and feel like he was contributing to his village. He didn't really like working with his hands, so clergymen don't work with their hands except in their free time. They go around counselling people, telling people, reminding people of what's important in life, ethics and morality. And yeah, I think I've already mentioned he would be happy. He would have a good life, a house, he'd be paid, he'd be respected, he'd be looked up in his community, be contributing to the community, and he would be educated. Oh, whoops, slight problem. This lad was not doing too well at school. Ouch. And to be a clergyman, he already spoke Welsh because that was his first language. I didn't tell you about that, but in Wales, especially at the time, everybody spoke Welsh. But when they went to school, they spoke English as well. So he spoke Welsh and English, but clergy people had to be able to know Latin another language extremely well. And his Latin was terrible, terrible. So, for whatever reason, we don't know why his Latin was terrible. Maybe you know why his Latin was terrible. Maybe is there something that you do that's not so good? And what reason do you have? I think it could be because he just didn't like it. He tried it a bit, didn't like it, and the more that he didn't like it, the less well he did. And his teacher didn't think that he was trying, and the more that the teacher didn't think he was trying, the more that he failed to do well. And he got himself into a little, what you call a vicious circle. The worse he got, the more that he didn't like it, the more that he didn't like it, the less he put into it, the less he put into it, the less well he did, the less well he did, the more his teacher didn't like it. Like him, the more his teacher didn't like him, the more he felt uncomfortable and desperately wanted to do well, but he didn't try to do well because actually all of his intention was focused on just getting by. And he wasn't really old enough to see that this was all dodgy and going to get him nowhere. In fact, he spent a lot of time worrying because he worried about how his life was going to go. What was he going to do if he didn't become a clergyman? How his father and mother would be so fed up and disappointed and sad if he didn't get into clergy college. How his teacher would feel smug that he already had recognized how bad this boy was at school. He imagined how he might not get a wife because he felt in his mind that the only person who'd want him would be somebody who'd want to see him as a clergyman or dressed in his clergy outfit. Even more people that might be upset. His grandparents who lived in the village, his other grandparents who didn't live in the village, his uncles and aunts who lived all scattered around villages in the area. In this area, everybody had close contact with everybody. So his relatives, they would feel that he had failed. The parents' friends, they would feel that he's failed. His friends, they would feel that he'd failed. And before he knew it, he was in a stew. A stew. His head was so full of the consequences of the Latin that he was not learning that he could not see a way out of this. And he got, every day that went by, he got more and more and more upset. And one day, it was all too much for him. And he actually left school. He'd never done anything like that. He just was like, his emotions were like a volcano inside of him. And it was all too much. And he went not very far. He went down to the river. I told you they had rivers there where people could swim. Well, it was the middle of a school day, nobody was swimming. And plus, there were so many places to swim. You know, he could go somewhere and be completely alone. So when people came looking for him, which they eventually did, he just concealed himself. And he stayed there, and he stayed there, and he stayed there. And when he stayed there, he just was consoled by the sound of the water, the look of the tree, the leaves in the trees, the rustling, perhaps the sound of animals Occasionally he might see a rabbit bouncing around, or a frog at some point, or a weasel. There were lots of animals in those woods. They didn't always make themselves seen, but the longer that somebody stayed, the more that it was possible to see things and appreciate things. And he saw the shape of the leaves as they were on the ground or in the trees. He saw the light passing as the hours went by. He tuned into the sound of the birds. He noticed the ripples on the river. And he felt very consoled. He stopped thinking about Latin altogether. And on this occasion, at a certain point, as it got darker, he took himself back off home. Now, the fact that he'd bunked off school wasn't without consequences. Of course, his mother said, "Where have you been?" And his dad said, "Where have you been?" And they mentioned that somebody had been looking for him. But in that time, it wasn't that unusual for a child to be out for a few hours. Normally, they'd be playing with friends. They didn't need supervising. They were expected to run around in nature, but not during school time. He had to think very fast. He'd never lied in his life. There was no need to. Mostly, apart from the Latin problem, his life was something that was pretty good. He didn't need to run away. But what was he going to tell them? Something wasn't right when he started to try and think of something to say. And in the end, he just shrugged. He just shrugged. And he said, "I can't tell you. I'm sorry." And he slunk off to bed. And his parents were quite worried about him because it was very unusual in those days for a child, well, young teenager by this time, to slink off to bed and not tell their parents what was going on. Although they appreciated the fact that he hadn't actually lied to them, he said he couldn't tell them. That, in both their point of view and his point of view, was pretty awesome because it was true. But they sat downstairs that night, and bear in mind, in a lot of houses those days, there was only wood between the upstairs bedroom and the downstairs. And so as he lay in his bed, he could hear voices coming through the floorboards. And he knew in his mind that they were talking about him. He could hear, he could hear the tone of their voices, and he could hear the fact that they cared about him. And he felt very upset. He started to cry a little. In those days, in that country, by the way, boys, I don't know what it's like in your country or your time, but uh, there was no taboo over boys crying. It was a perfectly normal reaction to distressing circumstances. And why he was distressed was because his mum and dad were worried about him. And frankly, he didn't want to be somebody that they worried about. But what was he going to do? What was he going to do? And then before he knew it, first of all, he's worried about his, sorry for laughing, he's worried about his Latin. Then he's worried about his mum and dad. And now he's worried, he's now panicking. And panicking is looking into the future and feeling hopeless and helpless. So, in a very short amount of time, he's going from being a really contented lad with a dream to being a discontent lad with a secret, a fear that something's not going to happen, a feeling of letting his parents down, and a state of panic that's just started, but looks like it's going to be part of his life. And what's going to happen? What's going to happen? I don't know what you think's going to happen, but he's not in a good way, is he? He's worried about letting all the, all these people shattering their expectations of him, expectations that he shared, remember? Because he wanted to do this thing. It wasn't like he was trying to do it just to please other people. What's he going to do? So, but if you remember, he was happy when he sat by the riverside. Why was he happy? Do you ever sit by the riverside? Or in nature? Do you ever go into nature? Do you ever feel the leaves of autumn crunching around your feet? Do you ever feel the breezes on your skin? Do you look out at the trees and watch branches coming and going with the wind, or hear the sounds of the birds? Oh yeah, of course you do. Of course you do, from time to time. Well, then you probably remember that you feel sometimes what's called the joy of being alive. The joy of being alive. Maybe that's a big word for it. What I mean is, when you're in that circumstances, you're not thinking about what's going to happen, what has happened, what might happen. You're just enjoying being there. And this is where I link into what I said before. And the more that you stay there, the more you tune in with what is there. And the more that you tune in with what is there, the more you realize you are part of what is there. And the more that you're part of what is there, the more that you're open and receptive to the answers to the questions that you didn't know that you were asking. That's not part of the story, by the way. That's my interpretation. So anyway, he feels drawn. He doesn't feel drawn to being around people. He feels the call of being on his own, but he thinks it's because he has this secret that he doesn't want to tell people about, because he fears what will happen if he feels what will happen. Now, okay, let's fast forward a certain amount of time. Maybe 6 months has gone by. After all, it takes a long time to learn Latin well enough to get into clergy college, and that's in fact where he needed to go in order to be a clergyman. He wasn't just going to leave school and be a clergyman. No. He was going to finish school, or finish that year of school, or the next year. He needed to do his Latin very, very, very well, and he needed to enter clergy college. So he went down to the riverside one day. This time he didn't skip school. It was a weekend, but he skipped church, which was just as bad. in those days, not only did everybody go to school like you guys do, like, well, you guys if you're a child. However, they didn't need to go until they didn't maybe go until they were like 18 or something. They went maybe until they were 14, but they all went to school. But also on a weekend, there were things that everybody did. Going to church was something that pretty much everybody did. So, like when I said that he was going to be a clergyman, he'd be somebody who was in communication with practically the entire village. That's if he stayed in the village where he would work. And there were mostly villages, not so much towns. So on this day, he and also not in addition to going to church with their parents, the children would generally also go to Sunday school where they would get extra lessons. But this time, uh, he'd been to church. He skipped not church. He skipped Sunday school, and he skipped Sunday school because he felt that he needed to be alone. But it wasn't what he normally did. And I'm going to stop and start the second part a bit later. Thank you for your attention.